SITREP World Briefing for June 5, 2026. Israeli airstrikes hit Gaza City overnight, killing at least 11 people and damaging multiple residential buildings, according to medics and local hospital accounts. Women and children were reported among the dead, and residents in the Sheikh Radwan neighborhood of Gaza City walked through heavy destruction after an apartment building was struck, with debris covering nearby streets and homes. The Israeli military said the strikes killed 4 Hamas security officials, while local medical officials and hospital staff described the casualties as civilians from residential sites across Gaza City. The attacks were reported on 4 residential buildings. Gaza City has remained a central battleground because it contains dense civilian districts, important Hamas infrastructure, and major roads linking the north of the enclave. The latest overnight raid added to the pressure on families already displaced or living in damaged housing. Hezbollah told Lebanese authorities that it rejected a renewed ceasefire agreement with Israel, breaking with a deal that the United States had announced after a fresh round of talks. A Hezbollah official said the group had informed Lebanon of its refusal, while the proposed arrangement was described as conditional and tied to demands over the terms of a halt in fighting and Israel's military posture. The rejection undercut a diplomatic effort presented on Wednesday night after U.S.-led negotiations. Hezbollah is the most powerful armed non-state actor in Lebanon, backed by Iran, and its refusal matters because any ceasefire on paper is hard to enforce if the group itself does not accept the terms communicated by Beirut and foreign mediators. The dispute also reflected broader regional pressure around the war, with a senior Iranian general reiterating Tehran's demand for a full ceasefire in Lebanon and calling for Israeli troops to pull back to positions held before the wider war began. That position showed that the ceasefire debate is not only a matter for Israel and Lebanon, but also part of a larger contest involving Hezbollah's patrons, U.S. diplomacy, and the terms under which any border calm could actually take hold. Israeli strikes hit Tyre in southern Lebanon overnight and killed 7 people, including victims in an attack near a hospital, after a ceasefire intended to halt the Israel-Hezbollah war. Lebanese officials also reported another Israeli strike in eastern Lebanon that killed 5 people, bringing the total from attacks in the south and east to 8 in one reported round of strikes. Tyre in southern Lebanon is one of the country's principal coastal cities and has strategic significance because it sits near areas that have repeatedly been drawn into fighting between Israel and Hezbollah. These attacks landed as the ceasefire itself was already under strain from Hezbollah's rejection of the agreement, leaving Lebanon exposed to both diplomatic breakdown and continued military action. The combination of strikes in Tyre and eastern Lebanon suggested that the truce had not produced an immediate stop to Israeli operations. The United States imposed sanctions on Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel and members of the Castro family in its latest move to tighten pressure on Cuba's leadership. The measures freeze any property and bank accounts held in the United States by the designated individuals. By targeting the serving Cuban president as well as relatives tied to the country's ruling revolutionary family, Washington signaled that it intends to raise the political cost for Havana's top leadership. The sanctions deepen a confrontation that has accelerated in recent months under Trump. Cuba's political system remains dominated by the Communist Party and by figures linked to the legacy of Fidel Castro and Raúl Castro, so sanctions on Diaz-Canel and Castro relatives are meant to hit symbolic and institutional centers of power at once. For Washington, the move is also a reminder that Cuba policy still carries heavy domestic and regional weight, especially when the White House wants to demonstrate that it is willing to use financial restrictions, visa pressure, and executive authority against adversarial governments in the Western Hemisphere. European Union leaders and their Western Balkan counterparts gathered in Tivat, Montenegro, on Friday for a summit framed by a renewed enlargement drive and a push from France and Germany for a staged path toward membership. The meeting in the Adriatic port town brings together the region's leaders with senior figures from the bloc's largest economies, including French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz. Paris and Berlin are promoting a gradual integration or building blocks approach intended to give Balkan candidates earlier access to parts of the EU system while formal membership negotiations continue. The choice of Tivat, Montenegro, highlights how enlargement has returned to the center of Europe's strategic debate after years of stalled accession talks across the Western Balkans. The six-country region has been treated in Brussels as a test of the EU's ability to stabilize its immediate neighborhood and turn political promises into institutional change. By advancing a phased model ahead of the summit, Macron and Merz aim to demonstrate that enlargement can progress without forcing the EU to choose between complete paralysis and immediate full entry. What leaders decide in Montenegro will shape whether candidate states see tangible rewards soon. Chinese President Xi Jinping is set to travel to Pyongyang, North Korea, on Monday for talks with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, in a rare visit that will mark his first trip to the capital in 7 years. The meeting will put the leaders of China and North Korea face to face at a moment when both governments are watching shifts in relations among Beijing, Washington, and Moscow. Because China remains North Korea's most important economic and diplomatic partner, even a short visit by Xi carries unusual weight for sanctions diplomacy, border trade, and the balance of influence on the Korean peninsula. The trip comes only weeks after Xi separately met or hosted the leaders of the United States and Russia, placing Kim's government back into a wider great power diplomatic sequence. North Korea's foreign policy is shaped heavily by the actions of Washington and Moscow, but Pyongyang also depends on Beijing for political cover and material support, which makes direct contact with Xi especially significant. A visit to Pyongyang after 7 years suggests that China wants to manage its leverage personally at the top level, reassure Kim Jong-un of continued engagement, and show that North Korea remains part of Beijing's regional calculations as competition among major powers intensifies across Northeast Asia. Officials, energy executives, and policy advisors meeting in Baku, Azerbaijan, for Baku Energy Week used the forum's final day to argue that the central constraint on new supply is no longer only production, but the ability of power systems and export networks to carry growing volumes. Speakers framed grid infrastructure as the event's defining bottleneck, while industry representatives also pressed the case for more spending on Azerbaijan's pipeline and energy assets. The debate reflected a broader view voiced at the conference that global consumption of oil, gas, coal, and renewables is still rising at the same time, forcing governments and companies to expand networks rather than assume one fuel source will quickly displace another. A senior U.S. official said in Baku that Washington wants a stake in Azerbaijan's pipelines and other energy infrastructure, adding a geopolitical dimension to a conference otherwise dominated by technical arguments over transmission capacity and investment needs. For Azerbaijan, the push matters because the country sits on a key corridor linking Caspian energy resources to export markets, and pipeline capacity has long been central to its economic strategy and diplomatic leverage. For the United States, deeper involvement would signal that commercial and strategic ties with Baku are moving beyond diplomacy and into long-term infrastructure ownership, financing, or partnership discussions. The arguments aired in Baku highlighted a wider tension now shaping energy policy from the Caspian to Europe and beyond. Demand growth is continuing across multiple fuel types, but investment in the wires, interconnectors, storage systems, and cross-border transport links needed to move that energy has lagged. That mismatch helps explain why Azerbaijan's infrastructure drew attention from both market participants and governments during the event. If consumption of fossil fuels and renewables keeps expanding together, as speakers at the forum argued, countries such as Azerbaijan that control export routes and can attract fresh capital for pipelines, grids, and related facilities are likely to play an outsized role in regional energy security and pricing discussions. Sources and the full written briefing are available at sitrepbrief.com.